It's not an isolated incident. It's actually a rather disturbing trend. Next on Michigan Podcast.
There's going to be one team that's going to play solely as a team. No man is more important than the team. No coach is more important than the team. The team, the team, the team.
Looks deeper in the front. Waits for it. It's caught.
This is no time for that. In the pocket and a sack. Tim Jamison.
Brady gets terrific. Throws it and a touchdown. Knight again. Schultz just before Brazil got him. And a leaping interception by Woodson.
Harbaugh back to throw over the middle. Caught by Collier at the 5 on his feet. Touchdown, Michigan. On its way. It's good.
He's 5'7", 179 pounds, a junior at Michigan. But Jamie Morris packs a wallop, and he delivers for Bo Schembechler.
And here's your first play. Pressure coming. Second. It is Glenn Steele, number 81, who fought his way through the traffic.
Option. And Robinson calls his own number, and he's going to score. Oh, an easy touchdown for Robinson and Michigan.
The MVP in today's ball game. You want to know who it is? I'm standing alongside his proud daddy, the quarterback Brian Greasy of Michigan.
Go Blue, and welcome to this week's Michigan Podcast. I am Steve Dace, and yes, even though we are just entering into the throes of summer, can you believe we are less than 50 days now, less than 50 days until Michigan football opens up camp in preparation of the 2017 season. If you like us here on Michigan Podcast, please consider liking this video here on YouTube, subscribing to our channel here on YouTube as well. You can also subscribe to our podcast via iTunes and Stitcher and also Google Play, and let us know what you think about what we think. Hit us up on the Twitters at Michigan Podcast. On Twitter is where you can find us there, and we'll get into our Twitter poll and some interesting results on a very controversial topic for any Michigan fan: alternative uniforms, of which you see me wearing one here this week. This was the Michigan throwback for the first night game several years ago, back in 2011. And yes, there's talk of more alternative uniforms for the Wolverines coming this fall, and that has touched off controversy. We'll look at what those might look like later on in this episode. Also, Bill Bender of the Sparty News and Street and Smith's college football preview. He will be joining us later today on the Michigan Podcast, and we'll take a look at some of the basketball coaching hires for our rivals at Ohio State and Indiana. That and more this week on the Michigan Podcast. But I want to begin with a term that is making the rounds throughout our culture nowadays. That would be the term fake news. Suppose there was a program that in the last year, maybe less, has lost 9 underclassmen. 9. Some of them left because they were allegedly dropping racial bombs on their teammates. Some of them left because they allegedly gang raped a woman. And then the player that allegedly reported on them himself allegedly was charged with sexual assault later on. This program lost the first, second, third, and fourth highest ranked players in their incoming recruiting class. Would you take a look at a program with that trend line, and would you say, if you were working in the media as I do, if you were a media pundit as I am in another walk of life, would you take a look at a program that has been through all of that and was doing this in the midst of a 3-9 season? By the way, 3-9, that like sucks. Would you look at that program and would you say, I think this is just an isolated incident? Well, you would. if you were a dispenser of fake news. Now, for the rest of us, though, that have to live in a place called reality, it's this: a complete and total dumpster fire. It is not an isolated incident. It is a rather disturbing trend for a program that also was 3-9 last year. Now, I am not one to sit here and wallow in the depravity of our rivals. I would rather win with my favorite team and not really care what anybody else is up to. That's just kind of how I roll. I'm not the fan that's like, well, yeah, my favorite team is whoever we're playing, or whoever, and my least favorite team's whoever we're playing, whoever Ohio State or Sparty's playing. I just don't care. I mean, if Ohio State and Michigan State winning is good for Michigan, I'll root for them. All I care about is what's good for Michigan. I root for Michigan. I don't root against anybody as much as I root for Michigan. So if we need Ohio State and Sparty to win, I'll root for them. If we don't, sucks to be you. That's kind of how I roll. But I am so disturbed by the amount of fake news we have seen. And this has been going on for years. And I'm sure Mark D'Antonio is a swell guy. I've never met him myself. But whatever he's done with the relationships, the voodoo dolls, whatever he's established as a media beachhead, the amount of covering that is going on for him right now is beyond disturbing. Props to Bob Wojnarowski at the Detroit News for accurately pointing out what I'm telling you here today. This last year of Sparty football has been a complete and total dumpster fire. When you're talking about 9 underclassmen leaving school before their eligibility is up, when you're talking about losing players who might be potential team captains for dropping racial bombs on their teammates, you're talking about gang rapes, and then gang rapes that get reported by a guy who later on gets charged with rape, and we only know who the whistleblower was because a Sparty on the board of trustees in the state of Michigan outed him, right? Because that's what you want to do. You want to out the whistleblower so maybe future whistleblowers won't come forth. This is a disaster. And it's been going on longer than this. How about a Rose Bowl where a prominent Sparty football player is suspended and then we never learn why? How about another Sparty player who gets busted for a Title IX violation of sexual assault, allegedly? It's so systemic, it's so catastrophic, it's so cataclysmic that we're now finding out former players were expelled from school for allegedly sexually assaulting co-eds, violating Title IX policies, domestic disturbances, as in the case of Keith Mumphrey, who that story recently came out, and then he was cut by the Houston Texans. Maybe it had nothing to do with that story, but the timing was certainly serendipitous. This is a major problem at Michigan State, and it has been for years. We're talking about a program where they literally airlifted a guy from the Polk so he could play a game in Iowa City on Saturday afternoon back in 2009. We're talking about a program where guys literally leave the Polk and show up at the practice field that very day. And when Bob Wojnarowski at the Detroit News wrote his piece, he didn't even bring up the infamous now Rather Hall, I guess we'll call it an incident. It's more like a riot. And so here we sit, as I've listened to media member after media member after media member, not mentioning any names, Jerry DiNardo at the Big Ten Network, go out of their way to protect and defend Mark D'Antonio while turning around and saying, well, all Jim Harbaugh's done is finish third in the Big Ten East 2 years in a row. Right, that's like saying all Urban Meyer's done is win one Big Ten championship. That's all he's won. He's also 61-6 in the Big Ten. Here's also what Jim Harbaugh has done. Not presided over a dumpster fire like Mark D'Antonio has at Michigan State. Listen, I'm a father of daughters. This is bigger than rivalries, Michigan State, what you do and don't think about each coach. This is about our own kids. And this is a program that, maybe if folks in the media would have defended D'Antonio all of these years and dubbed him as some kind of bishop directly sent to us from the archdiocese themselves, maybe if he wasn't wrongly given the title of Dean of Big Ten Discipline, maybe if they'd not fluffed D'Antonio all these years, maybe we wouldn't have the environment that has led to the complete and total dumpster fire we have now. And I'll close with this. After Michigan State beat Iowa in a great Big Ten championship game 2 years ago, L.J. Scott with that phenomenal goal line run to win the Big Ten championship that night. After the game, Mark D'Antonio went out on the field and instead of, enjoying the event, got on about the highest of high horses you could possibly imagine and literally said, I'm not ashamed to say it, I think we have the Lord's favor. Indeed, pride, Mr. D'Antonio, cometh before the fall, because since you uttered that statement, your program is 3-10 and is now immersed in a national scandal.
At the half of 24-21 at the moment as Michigan looks at 3rd and goal from the 2. Play fake, Greasy on the roll, pulls up, there's Jeremy Tillman, and Michigan leads.
Well, every year, it's one of my favorite college football preseason magazines. It's the Sparty News, otherwise now known as Street and Smith's, which used to be a big-time football magazine and is back again just in its new form as the Sparty News. I hope I didn't confuse everybody. But one of the men behind this fantastic publication joins us now. Bill Bender from the Sparty News and Street and Smith's is here with us on the Michigan Podcast. Good to see you, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me on.
So, Bill, let's start with the home team and the Michigan Wolverines. I find them, as I've told our podcast audience already, beyond just I'm a fan. I'm a big college football fan. I'm a fanatic, really, of the sport itself. It's one of the few sports that I will still follow every bit as closely, regardless of how good my favorite team is, and not lose interest. So, just looking at it analytically, and not even as a Wolverine, I find Michigan to be one of the most fascinating teams to try and size up this preseason, because of how well they've recruited the last 2 years, but also because when you throw that in with how many of these guys are going to be playing, because of how many starters they lost. And, you know, we used to look at evaluating teams when we looked at publications like yours. You'd always look at returning starters. Well, last year, Clemson had 24 freshman and sophomore eligibles, and it's too deep. This year, it looks like Michigan may have 26. So there's a lot of similarities there, but I think it's maybe a little tougher to evaluate Michigan because of that youth. What do you think, Bill?
Yes. I mean, you lose that many starters. You have that many guys go to the NFL draft. It works two ways, because I think Jim Harbaugh obviously developed a lot of Brady Hoke recruits, the Chris Wormleys, the Taco Charltons. You didn't really need to develop Jabril Peppers, but you get where I'm going there. And now a lot of the guys that he recruited are going to start to play. And, he talked to Sporting News early in the spring and said the waters are hot. The competitions are going to be very hot. And, I don't think the defensive line's a question mark. And when I look at a team, and like you said, sizing up a team, I look at two things. I look at their quarterback. Michigan has their quarterback coming back. And then I look at the defensive line. And Michigan may not have as many people on that defensive line, but when you can build around Rashawn Gary, that's a really good thing.
So when you guys were evaluating Michigan, you decided to rank them where and why in comparison to the teams that were in a similar sort of allotment of squads that you were comparing at the same time?
Yeah, I mean, we put them in the top 10, which might seem like a stretch to most people. You do that, you get them, and they're the third Big Ten team we have ranked. I mean, we have Ohio State in the top 5. We have Penn State, I believe we have sitting 7. So, I mean, you when you look at Michigan, I think in the top 10 at that 9 spot's pretty fair. I know the reaction to that will probably be mixed. You'll say, like, why are they ranked 9? They had all these guys I think you'll see them as low as 14 or 15. But I'm trusting the program at this point. I'm trusting that Jim Harbaugh. Is it? You could probably help me with this. I believe it's back-to-back top 5 recruiting classes, and when you have that kind of talent coming in, that certainly helps.
Is Jim Harbaugh already on the benefit of the doubt list of coaches, where you just know, regardless of who or what is coming back, because of the program that's been built and their resume, that there's just a certain floor that they won't go beneath? So is he on that list with, we only have 4 coaches, as you well know right now, and that are coaching in the sport that have won national titles. So, but is he in that list of benefit of the doubt coaches with Dabo Swinney and Nick Saban and Urban Meyer and Jimbo Fisher? Is he there yet in your mind, Bill? And did that factor into you guys deciding to keep Michigan in the top 10 despite those heavy personnel losses?
If he's not in that discussion, he's close. And I say that because you kind of stole my answer, in that those 4 guys with national championships, whether it's Saban, Meyer, Dabo Swinney, or Jimbo Fisher, they've developed their recruiting classes. They have more talent than Michigan right now because it's been accumulated. But I think Jim Harbaugh steps up. He's starting to catch up. If you're making those coaches list, and I don't want to spoil anything because ours come out later in the month, Jim Harbaugh is probably the next guy in that discussion because of the track record in the NFL, at Stanford, and now at Michigan, where I think he's really starting to build through the recruiting. You're seeing them get more five-star guys, like guys like Donovan Peoples-Jones, Aubrey Solomon, and I think that's a big difference within the program once he starts to stockpile some more of that 4- and 5-star talent.
All right, let's play a couple fill in the blanks here about the Wolverines before we move on and look at the Big Ten and the national picture with Bill Bender from Street and Smith's Sporting News College Football Preview. Michigan's floor this season is blank, and why?
7-5 would be the worst case scenario because that means they lose to Florida, Michigan State, Penn State on the road, and then they somehow lose to Wisconsin and Ohio State in the last 2 games of the year. So I think a nightmare scenario in year 3 for Jim Harbaugh. Penn State, I think that's the absolute floor, and I don't know that any other team on the schedule would beat them.
When you consider your floor, Bill, is 7-5, and if Brady Hoke had beaten Maryland at home his last season to get bowl eligible, he probably wouldn't have been fired. I think that tells you the growth that Jim has instilled into the program already in just his first 2 years. So let's see how far that growth can go. Michigan's ceiling this year is blank.
11-1. I can say that. I mean, it sounds crazy coming out of my mouth right now, given all those losses like you said, but if they beat Florida, I'll tell you this, if they beat Florida, take care of business against Michigan State, avoid a trappy game like an Air Force or a Cincinnati or whatever, and they go to Penn State and win, I think that's the launch point game that could launch the program because it's not going to be easy. It's going to be a whiteout. But if they win that game, the confidence that comes with that means I think they barrel into the second half of the season. That split at the end's tough against Wisconsin and Ohio State. But if they beat Penn State and Florida, Michigan fans will have to be thrilled because I think they'll be in very good shape for, at the very least, another berth in the New Year's Day 6.
Bill, I'd love to get, since you mentioned Florida, I'd like to get your perspective on the Gators because they're a team that lost almost as much on defense as Michigan has. They've not recruited quite to the level Michigan has the last couple of years. Defensively, though, going back to the Will Muschamp era, they've always been salty, regardless of how many wins and losses they've had, and that's primarily why Jim McElwain's won the SEC East his first 2 years, despite, other than the flash in the pan they had with Will Grier, anemic quarterback play. They just brought in Malik Zaire, and I'm intrigued to see how this fit's going to work, because really you've got 2 games. The Music City Bowl in 2014 when LSU had no film on him at all, and then the opener against Texas, and that was arguably the worst Texas team in 100 years. In fact, that Texas team had 8 of its 12 opponents that fall score at least 30 points against them, and he lit them up. But the very next week against Virginia, he struggled on the road, got hurt. Notre Dame nearly lost that game until Deshaun Kaiser hit a last-minute touchdown to bail them out. And then, of course, he ended up excelling and taking the job from Malik the rest of the way. So we don't really have a body of work on him. Doug Nussmeier is the OC in Florida, and we as Michigan fans saw what happened when he tried to take Devin Gardner, a guy with a very similar skill set to Malik Zaire, and tried to take Devin Gardner and fit him into his offensive scheme, and that ended up being the season that got Brady Hoke fired. So I'm fascinated to see how that's going to work, and what does that mean about what they really think of the 2 redshirt freshmen they've been grooming for that job, that maybe they're not that confident. What's your read of that entire situation, Bill?
Very interesting. I think for Michigan fans, this is not going to be the same Florida team they saw in the bowl game a couple years ago. They've got a little more depth through recruiting. The quarterback play should be decent. Now, here's my read on it, in that I think Felipe Franks, after watching him in the spring game, I thought he was the starter. I think there's their guy. He looked good enough. He got the ball down the field, made some quick throws. That'll be the starter. I think Zaire throws a hook in it. And like you said, Malik Zaire, for all that's been written about him, and I've done that too, has not played a lot. Did not win the starting job against Deshaun Kaiser, and here we are talking about him now. So I don't think it's a given he'll start. I don't think it's a given Franks will start. Luke Del Rio may factor in, but if I had to put just my read on it, I think Felipe Franks will start against Michigan. And they've got talent on the defensive side. My bigger concern for Michigan in that game will be, how are they going to move the ball with this new group of receivers? Are they going to find that consistent running game when they have to? Because to me, that's the only thing holding the program back in any way, was in those losses to Iowa, to Florida State, to Ohio State. If you look at the yards per carry, it was not good, and they couldn't run the ball when they needed to. That's the first thing I'll be watching out of Michigan in that football game.
All right, let's look at the Big Ten as a whole. We opened up the podcast this week talking about the dumpster fire that is Michigan State, and as sad and tragic as it is for now, let's set aside the specific circumstances that have led to the attrition, from racial bombs allegedly to alleged gang rapes, etc. They've lost 9 players that they were counting on in this year's Two Deep. They have lost them this offseason. They lost the top 4 recruits in their incoming class. Where are they at right now, Bill? I mean, it's funny, too, because just a year ago at this time, Michigan fans were looking at the Michigan State game the way they're looking at the Ohio State game now. Like, hey, regardless of what our record is, we've got to reassert ourselves in this rivalry again. We got to win that game. And how huge that was as a pivot point. Many of us as Michigan fans thought the Sparty game in East Lansing was going to be the pivot point game that you just said you thought Penn State might be for Michigan this year. And now they are an afterthought. Have we seen a program with this sort of fall from grace this instantly? To me, this is even faster than what transpired at Baylor. They fell apart and still won a bowl game. Michigan State fell apart, went 3-9, and then the next offseason, this one's been even worse, Bill.
Yeah, and I went to their spring game, and the mood of the program was they had to move on from this sexual assault investigation, which was still ongoing at the time. Obviously, I think the things that have needed to happen there, and I will give Mark D'Antonio credit for not obstructing the legal process, kind of the proper protocol, but, and you can't control, sometimes you just can't control player behavior, but in this case, they've had a lot of incidences of player behavior, and you want to talk about pivot points, and I don't want to cheat and look at the year, but if it comes down to it, Michigan State, Michigan this year is such a critical game for Michigan State for all of those reasons you mentioned. This shouldn't be an afterthought to them given what they've built. This is always, it was an uncomfortable game in some ways for Michigan last year. I think it still could be that, but and you can help me with the year. Whatever the year that Michigan beat Michigan State 49-3, and that was the end of Bobby Williams.
2002, right?
There you go. And did that not? That kind of sent the Michigan State program into a 5-year tailspin. So that to me is the floor for Michigan State this year if something similar were to happen in that game.
Penn State, I like what they have coming back, particularly offensively. I think they're going to be very explosive there. I mean, Godwin was a very good receiver, but that's a position where when you've recruited at least halfway decent, you can find bodies for that. Defensively, I'm not sure who the guy is on defense. Like you mentioned Rashawn Gary earlier. When you're the opposing quarterback and you're coming up to the line of scrimmage, who's the guy on the Penn State defense, Bill, that you look at and say, all right, I got to know where such and such is? I would argue Michigan's got 2 or 3 of those guys between Gary, Mo Hurst, Michael McCray. I'm not sure who that guy is for Penn State. And then I wonder about the preseason expectation level for this program. None of these guys, it's not abnormal for Penn State, one of the great programs of all time, to have preseason expectations. But for this group of Penn State players, they've never faced anything like the hype they have going into this year. Again, it's fast. It's quick. It's amazing how quickly things change. When they lost to Pitt last year, people were talking like, man, they better beat Minnesota at home or James Franklin's toast. I mean, we were talking about who the next Penn State coach might be in early October a year ago, and now they're the defending Big Ten champs. Are they ready for the preseason expectation and burden that goes along with that, Bill?
We're going to find out. I know that they are the one team in the country, I think Alabama's the other one, that has 2 legit Heisman candidates in their backfield, in McSorley and Saquon Barkley. Barkley's one of the best, if not we have him ranked as the best running back in the country. You asked about the defense. The guy on that side would be Marcus Allen, pretty good safety, a lot of tackles, makes some plays. But here are 2 things when I think about Penn State. And when those, I don't gamble or anything like that or anything, but when those early lines came out and you had Michigan was a 14-point dog at Penn State, I thought that was remarkably high.
It went down to 9 points overnight. So many people bet Michigan on that early line, by the way.
Remarkably high, yeah. And I think that'll be a less than 10-point game, even though it's a whiteout and everything that goes into that. Now, the one game I'm just not confident that Penn State can go to Columbus and win. And that's in a big game that matters. And I think those three teams, again, it's much like last year where Penn State, Michigan, Ohio State, what if they all go 11-1 and round robin beat each other? What would the Big Ten do then? I mean, that's the next doomsday scenario for me that would be worse than last year when all three teams were borderline playoff worthy.
Who is your dark horse? Northwestern's the annual dark horse. Pat Fitzgerald's one of my man crush coaches. He's made a career off of being a dark horse. But when their over-under came out from Vegas this week and it was 8.5, they're not a dark horse. It's clear the jury's out. They're going to be pretty good with Justin Jackson and Clayton Thorson back in the offensive backfield. A team I've got an eye on is Indiana. Here's why. They have, I think, the best. Now, granted, this is a low bar, Bill, okay? But I think this is the best defensive personnel they've had since the Van Waiters days in the late 80s when they had Anthony Thompson and Bill Mallory was the coach. I think and that means for Indiana, I don't think they're Michigan or Ohio State, but I think they go from maybe being that last year they were competent on defense. This year I think they could be effective. They've got, I think, a guy with pro type of ability at quarterback. We know they're going to be able to run the football. I think they're a team that too many folks are sleeping on because just as we talked about Penn State players not really used to this burden of expectations, this era of Indiana football player is sort of accustomed to a certain standard of, hey, we've been to bowl games 2 years in a row. And when I look at their schedule, and yes, they're in the East where it's tough to surprise, but outside of, when they play that Big Three, tell me what game is the other one of those 9 games on their schedule outside of the Big Three. They even get Wisconsin at home. Tell me which one of those other 9 games you think, there's no way they could win that one. I think, I love PJ Fleck. There's a lot of hype with him in Minnesota because of his persona. I mentioned Northwestern, but I think maybe one Big Ten team that we're sleeping on, and when I say sleeping on, I think they go in 7 or 8 games. I think it's Indiana.
Yeah, I'm looking at their schedule now. That could be an 8-7 win, at least 8 wins, maybe. Such a huge tone setter for them for so many reasons, though, with Ohio State coming in, obviously the Kevin Wilson stuff that happened last year. And what if Ohio State comes in and blows their door off?
Good point.
Doors up? That's one thing I'd be watching. But, yeah, looking at their schedule, it's got 8-4 on it. It does. I would co-sign that. Now, you mentioned kind of my dark horse. If I can't have Northwestern, I'd probably take Minnesota because I think P.J. Fleck – it's going to bring some enthusiasm, but then a couple things there. Quarterback, definitely uncertain. Offensive line injuries all over the place, so those are 2 bad things. But they've got a really good running game, and I think he's going to – it might not be this year, but he's going to shake things up in the Big Ten West, and you and I know why. Obviously the row the boat, the persona he has is pretty big, and it'll be interesting to see how that meshes with the Paul Chryst and Kirk Ferentz and the pretty not overly stated coaching style in that division.
All right, final question, and this is the perfect question we ask in the middle of June when camp is less than 50 days, if you can believe it. Michigan opens camp July 31st. That is less than 50 days from today, Bill. So you look at 2 coaches that I don't think any Big Ten coach is going into the year on the hot seat yet. But depending on how the seasons go, I think there are 2. We mentioned Michigan State. I think Mark D'Antonio could be on the hot seat if they don't get to a bowl game again. I also think you take a look at Nebraska. And when their over-under in Vegas is 6.5, I've got to believe that's the lowest over-under for Nebraska football in the history of over-unders. And you go down to Orlando, Florida. I think one of the reasons why Charlie Strong had so much pressure on him last year was Tom Herman. Former Texas assistant in their own backyard. Everybody knows he's a hot commodity. USC, if Clay Helton may not, he may come after him. LSU wants him after they get rid of Les Miles. And they could not allow the guy who's their favorite son in their own backyard to walk away as a potential once-in-a-generation fit and then live to regret it for the next 10 years. And I think that put extra pressure on Charlie Strong. You look at Central Florida with Scott Frost. Other than Tommy Frazier, arguably the most popular living Nebraska player from the contemporary era right now. Offensive coordinator at Oregon, where they were competing for national championships, goes to Central Florida. They go from 0-12 to a bowl game last year. If Nebraska struggles again, I could see Nebraska boosters saying, hey, listen, if we don't grab Scott Frost right now, someone else is going to grab him, and then we won't be able to get him next year if our 60-something-year-old head coach Mike Riley can't turn things around. Your thoughts on those two scenarios with Michigan State and Nebraska, where I think they're the places most likely, if anybody ends up on the hot seat in December, I think it's one of those, if not both of those places, Bill.
Yeah, I would start with Michigan State. I don't know. We don't need to rehash all those, but certainly a telling year for Mark D'Antonio there, given it's got to be right on and off the field this year. Nebraska, yes, the Scott Frost thing, it just makes so much sense in that here's why everything you said makes sense. Because if they don't do it, let's say they go, what did you say the over-under?
6.5.
Okay, let's say they don't go over that. They go 5-7, 6-6. It's a miserable year, and they don't want to do Mike Riley anymore, and they want Scott Frost, but they don't get him. What's going to happen is what's going to kind of happen with Michigan, where I think for 7 years, maybe not 7, but at least 4 of the post-Lloyd Carr era, the word Jim Harbaugh started, maybe 5 years before. And Scott Frost will be in connection with Nebraska until it actually happens. So I could totally see them monitoring him very closely in comparison with Mike Riley. It's not necessarily fair to Mike Riley, but you're talking to a team that's come into the Big Ten and hasn't quite made that splash by winning their first conference championship.
Bill Bender from the Sporting News and Street and Smith's College Football Preview. Folks, if you picked this up, I mean, this thing is just, it is packed with information. It's a phenomenal national preview. It's a Bible. It's got everything you're looking for. I mean, everything. Recruiting, everything. They do a great job every year. Bill, thanks for joining us here on the Michigan Podcast. We really appreciate it.
Hey, as long as we can do it again during the season, guys, I enjoyed this so much. I know it's way, way early, but I always love talking football, even when it's in June.
You got it, man. We'll definitely bug you again when the leaves start changing colors. Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.
Back with more Michigan Podcast here in a moment.
Well, there's Antoine Winfield. All he needs to do is get over on the other side a little bit. Back goes Jackson. And he's got a problem. Still struggling. Now throws it in. Intercepted. It went right to Andre Weathers. And Weathers will score a touchdown. Oh, that could be a will breaker. So Craig Baker had one blocked, and that got him on the bench last week, and Feely comes right on this week and does the same thing. But here's the interception, the struggle, the eternal effort, trying to do more than you can, and he was in the grasp of Sam Sword, tried to deliver the ball, simply couldn't do it, and it went right into the stomach of Andre Weathers, who swallowed it.
Sometimes quarterbacks try to do too much.
Yep.
Next, I would like to thank the administrations at both Indiana University and the Ohio State University for not making John Beilein's job as the Michigan basketball coach any harder with their coaching hires this offseason. Because they essentially hired two men whose resumes are not as impressive as the men they got rid of prior to their arrivals on campus. Now, I pointed this out on some Michigan message boards here in the past week, and I got some blowback, but let's look at the actual numbers. What's the data say? I love data. So let's go to the data. Let's start with Indiana. Here was Tom Crean's resume prior to arriving in Bloomington. 4 NCAA tournaments, a Final Four, 3 seasons of 25-plus wins. And the reason we're going with 25 is because 20-plus wins doesn't mean as much as it used to with the amount of games these teams play nowadays. To me, 25 is more the benchmark of a truly outstanding season. So he had 3 seasons of 25 or more wins prior to coming to Indiana. And there is Archie Miller, his successor. 4 NCAA tournaments, an Elite 8, 3 seasons of 25-plus wins. So the numbers right there just show you Indiana essentially hired a guy with almost the exact same profile as Tom Crean, but not as good of a resume. One guy went to the Final Four, the other guy did not, right? Well, Steve, what's the big difference? It's just one round. Listen, if you were a fan of some schools that haven't been to some Final Fours despite a lot of success, like Purdue hasn't been to a Final Four since 1980, for example, or Iowa hasn't been to a Final Four since that exact same year, 1980. If you were a fan of some of those schools that have won a lot of games the last few decades but haven't been to a single Final Four, you know there's a pretty big difference between getting to the Elite 8 and the Final Four. How about Ohio State? Here was Thad Matta's resume prior to arriving in Columbus. He went to 4 NCAA tournaments, 1 Elite Eight. He had 3 seasons of 25 or more wins, and he did that at both Butler and Xavier. His successor, whom they just hired and gave an 8-year contract to, 8 years, Chris Holtmann, 3 NCAA tournaments, 1 Sweet 16, 1 season of 25 or more wins. Now, I heard a lot of people in the college basketball intelligentsia say, well, Ohio State wouldn't have ran Thad Matta at this lateness of the hour unless they had somebody in mind. This is what they had in mind, what you guys just saw there on the screen. Someone with a lesser resume than Thad Matta had when they brought him in several years ago. And essentially the difference in the Butler programs from when Thad Matta was there compared to Chris Holtmann, night and day. I mean, when Thad Matta was there, they were just building themselves into a mid-major power. Chris Holtmann is in a line of succession now. Coach after coach after coach after coach has used Butler, beginning with guys like Barry Collier and Thad Matta, have used Butler as a stepping stone job. What proof do we have that he can recruit at all? I'd say the same thing about Archie Miller at Indiana. I mean, Dayton has been a consistent mid-major program and winner. Long before Archie Miller showed up, Brian Gregory, the former Michigan State assistant, did a fine job at Dayton. Got hired by Georgia Tech from that job, and then was a disaster on that job. So, listen, coaching in the Big Ten is tough enough. It's already a murderer's row most years, and they're talking now about expanding the conference from 18 games to 20 league games. So, as a huge Michigan basketball fan, I just wanted to thank the administrations in Indiana and in Ohio State. I want to thank them for doing us a rock solid, because they didn't make John Beilein's job any harder with these hires at all.
J.D. Carlson, now a senior, is in to try a 20-yard field goal. He's 3 out of 6 between the 20 and the 30 this season. They go with a shovel pass. It goes to the goal line. It is not yet. It is Greg McThomas, and he did not score. They went for the gimmick, the trick play. They didn't score, but hold on. They may have a first down, because they could possibly have made a first down without scoring. The ball was just short of the 10-yard line. So let's see what happens when they stretch it out. Ohio State's had their team on the field, but that wasn't the case. They did get the first down.
Well, they didn't get the touchdown. Here's a look at it. McThomas is here. The snap's going to come back, and he's just going to get a little shovel pass right here, and he's going to have a guard pulling. Actually, that's the tight end that pulls around. Boy, that's tough. You stop him short of the goal line. I don't know if he may have even gotten in, but certainly a first down.
Now, this week's Twitter poll results, and again, you can follow us on Twitter at Michigan Podcast. We asked you this last week, what would you like Michigan's just announced alternative home uniform for this season to be? 11% of you said something patriotic. 22% said all maize unis, which Harbaugh has joked about using in the past. 28% said you'd like maize jersey and blue pants. 39% of you gave the answer I would have given, which is never mess with the home unis. I mean, I hate to be all Johnny Dangerously. My mom messed with Michigan's home unis once, but you don't mess with perfection, man. You don't. Now, I say that and then have to acknowledge, I'll be 44 years old here in a few weeks. As my kids like to remind me, I'm getting old. And I'm starting to sound like get off my lawn guy, right? The players love the alternative jerseys. So that brings us to this week's question of the week. Let's go ahead. We'll play along. Steve in Iowa. Wonder who that is. Anyway, Steve in Iowa asks, what would some potential Michigan alternate jerseys look like? So we went around and consulted the great Mr. Google for some ideas. And here were some of the proposals Mr. Google was kind enough to spit back to us. Now, this look where you bring in sort of the state of Michigan into the uniform, I got to tell you, man, and I'm not an alternate uniform guy. I think, as my 10-year-old son Noah would say, I think those are pretty dope. Now, I hate the gray. I hate teams using gray. Like I like at Tennessee, for example. They have these beautiful orange uniforms, some of the prettiest in college football, and then they come out with this pewter gray. You know what? You deserve to suck for that. I mean, that is a total uniform foul. And as you continue here on the Michigan podcast, you will learn that I am your self-appointed uniform czar. But if you're going to do gray, the gray in that look right there and that alternative look for Michigan, I think that is pretty slick. The white look is good. The maize and blue look is good. Now, Michigan, I doubt, would ever do anything like that. But even the block M, I like where the number's located. Those could grow on me. I mean, I wouldn't change our uniforms to that, but I could see busting that out maybe once a decade. Now, here is what it might look like in the new Jumpman Nike apparel deal Michigan has. Here's what maize jerseys might look like. Yeah, I've seen these before. Oh, yeah. We're West Virginia now. I mean, that's essentially what those uniforms are. Those are West Virginias. It's almost the exact same thing that they wear at home. So it could be worse, I guess, but that's not any better than the jerseys we wear now, which are arguably the best in college sports. Here's another look. This is sort of a fan graph collection that I found, and this looks more like you're dressing the Wolverine, as in Hugh Jackman, than the Wolverines, all right? This looks like somebody's really frustrated that Hugh Jackman never put the yellow and blue iconic Wolverine uniform on in any X-Men or any Wolverine movie, so he just wanted somebody to wear it, because that does not look like any kind of a Michigan football to me, or Michigan football uniform to me at all. Listen, I know the Michigan marketing department is probably not watching right now, okay? But I'm going to give them a little tip here nonetheless, right? If you want to do the greatest alternate uniform troll of all time, one troll to rule them all, pick up the mic, drop it, we're done here. This would be peak Harbaugh right here. Promote some game as we're busting out what we are calling our best college football uniform ever, alternate jerseys, for this Saturday. Hype that puppy up, generate a bunch of media speculation, have them debated on ESPN and other college sports channels. What's Michigan going to wear? What are they going to wear? How dare they call this the greatest uniform ever? And then, when you kick it off that Saturday, and they start playing the victors after that sweet James Earl Jones pump-up video, and they crank it up, and the team comes out of the tunnel to slap the banner, they're wearing the exact same uniforms we wear every Saturday. All right, that's what I would do. That would be the greatest uniform troll of all time. Yes, we're busting out alternate jerseys this weekend. We're calling them the leaders and best, the greatest alternate uniform, the greatest college football uniform of all time. And then it's the exact same uniforms you wear every Saturday.
And Lloyd Carr and the Wolverines are saved. Suck it down, and 8 hits into throwing. Looking for someone to get free. Cross, dangerous, real danger. Michigan, Terrell goes up, jump ball, and pulls it down. Oh, there's no more dangerous play for a quarterback than throwing back to the middle. And number 1 said, let's play a little basketball.
Finally, this week on the Michigan podcast, never forget. Never forget what happened to us, the malfeasance we experienced last year in Columbus. Never forget. Because, you know, it is commonplace for officials who are from the same state as the home team to slap the home players on the ass and tell them good play in the middle of the game. Never forget this, ever. In fact, let it fuel you the rest of this offseason. Just as Bo once famously said, the screw job of the vote back in '73, that's what he used to fuel him the rest of his career, that if you ever thought about letting up, if you ever thought about, taking his foot off the gas at all, he remembered what happened to those players in that moment. He remembered. And that's what he used to fuel him once more. Never forget what happened last year in Columbus. Don't ever forget it. Don't ever let them get away with it. And we're going to use that to fuel us between now and when they come to our place in November. That'll do it for this week's Michigan podcast. Again, don't forget, subscribe via iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, right here on YouTube as well. Click and like our video and help us get the word out. Share it with everybody you know if you like what we're doing here. We'll see you again next week on the Michigan podcast. Go Blue.